When my tears were finally spent, I felt a calmness wash over me. I felt the circle finally close. I realized that who I was, what I cared about, was no longer just a matter of intellect or obligation, no longer a construct of words. I'm Kaya Allo, and welcome to Ink and Spine, a space between words and sound, where each week we sit together with a book, an album, or a film to connect, savoring each slowly at the sweet pace of honey. Thank you again for joining me as we complete our exploration and reflection on the book Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. It has been a real treat to spend these past 3 weeks of July going through Barack's early childhood in Hawaii, his adventures in Indonesia, returning back to Hawaii, traveling to California for his undergrad, and then to New York. And we left off in Chicago, where Barack was embarking on a new chapter, his law studies at Harvard. I invite you to listen back to the previous episodes and take a visit to your local library. The book is so worth the trip. If you choose to purchase the book and hold on to it, visit your local bookstore. And if that isn't accessible, I have a link in the show notes for you to purchase the book on Amazon. If you are just joining me on this episode, feel free to stick around because you are welcome here. The ethos of this podcast is to savor books, music, films, varying art forms at the sweetest pace of honey. This is a place of ease, so you are welcome anytime. Before we dive into these final chapters, I wanted to dedicate reverent time in acknowledgement, prayer, thought, and care for those that are most impacted by the wildfires that are burning. In particular, First Nations communities, such as the Collins First Nation community, the Gulf Bay First Nation, and for the many that we unfortunately will not hear about in the news. Thousands of people from dozens of nations that are so far away from home. We hold you close. We pray. And for those of you that are listening that have the capacity to extend resources to help, I'll be sure to include some links in the show notes. And if you do have resources or helpful information that can be shared, please drop a line. I'd be so grateful to be able to spread awareness and help wherever possible. We hold our fellow neighbors close, in mind and in heart, never to be forgotten and doing what we can. We carry forward with you. Chapter 15 opens in the Nairobi airport, and as Barack is trying to navigate his lost luggage, a British Airways employee named Miss Omuro asks him on page 163, "You wouldn't be related to Dr. Obama by any chance?" That's his father, Barack Sr. Imagine, shortly upon arriving on this land, the soil that knows Barack better than he knows himself at this point. Already he's identified. Already he's acknowledged as belonging. On page 164, Barack writes, "For the first time in my life, I felt the comfort, the firmness of identity that a name might provide, how it could carry an entire history in other people's memories, so that they might nod and say knowingly, 'Oh, you are so-and-so's son.' No one here in Kenya would ask how to spell my name or mangle it with an unfamiliar tongue. My name belonged, and so I belonged. Drawn into a web of relationships, alliances, and grudges that I did not yet understand. This passage is such a beautiful welcome to his home, because in previous chapters, I think about the young Barack who had envied Regina while at Occidental College, and then with age, the organizing Barack in Chicago who spoke of borrowing other people's histories to create a chain of his own between his life, theirs, and purpose and belonging. But within a few moments of arriving in Nairobi, already someone knows his name. For you, I'm curious, do you know what your name holds? Who taught you how to say your name? As the chapter evolves, it's Oma's turn this time to pick up her brother from the airport. In previous chapters, Barack was the one excited to pick his sister up from the airport in Chicago when she came to visit. And now Barack is visiting Kenya, and Oma gets to be a part of his welcome party. There's something that Barack talks about that I long for. He describes this physical ease, this physical freedom on page 167. You could experience the freedom that comes from not feeling watched, the freedom of believing that your hair grows as it's supposed to grow, and that your rump sways the way a rump is supposed to sway. Barack speaking about this freedom of not feeling watched, it reminds me of what we spoke about in the last episode, our new learned term of stereotype threat. This tax that is imposed on the mind through environment. And it seems here that Barack gets to experience what it actually feels like to belong before he even has spent a full day in Nairobi. I can imagine his shoulders coming down with ease. For you, where does your body feel at rest? At ease? When do your shoulders come down? Is it a place? Who is there? Barack quickly learns as he is becoming acquainted with this new place that is home, that even in places where we belong or we feel at home, they aren't necessarily utopia. Barack's romanticism and fantasies are quickly confronted as he and Oma sit at a restaurant and they find themselves sitting and waiting, unserved, as beside them an American family is enjoying service before them. The colonial arithmetic seems to outlive the flags in a way that isn't often acknowledged. But even with this imperfection, home is still beautiful. Becomes acquainted with not only his home, but also his relatives. He meets so much family. There are aunts, there are uncles, there are cousins and half-siblings. And each of these people hold a different version of his old man. And unfortunately, the politics and complicated dynamics arise very quickly. Auntie Zaytouni hands Barack some pretty hefty wisdom right off the bat. On page 181, she says, if you have something, then everyone will want a piece of it. So you have to draw the line somewhere. If everyone is family, no one is family. Your father, he never understood this, I think. This is how Barack introduces us to chapter 17, and he's sitting silently in the car, just turning this over in his mind. He's wondering, is Zaytouni out to lunch or is she right? He admits that when he'd arrived in Kenya, he had hoped to force his world into a singular, harmonious whole that made sense. Instead of the divisions that have kept him in these fractured multiplicities, he had really hoped that in the same ways Asante spoke about the beauty of the motherland in the previous episode, that his belonging would be just as romantic and easeful. But there is a distinct difference between Obama's experience in Kenya and that of Asante's. Though Asante might be able to trace his ancestry to Kenya, It's different for Barak as he is not just arriving on soil, he is arriving into that complexity that arises with humanness. I'm chuckling when I think about the Bible verse that says, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am." But in this case, I wonder if it could be remixed to, "Where two or three share blood, well, get ready to rumble, honey." For me, though I spent the first decade of my life in my home country, I've spent the majority of my life returning as a grateful visitor. I'm so lucky that I have even had the opportunity to return to my home soil. Yet I have so much compassion for Barak as the paperwork and the seriousness of allocation and land and more pertinent matters take precedent over belonging and connecting with family on a human level. I too romanticize about going home one day in the future, maybe as a mother or as a grandmother, and reintroducing myself to this place that was home. Barak is really yearning for this deeper connection as he is introduced to Ruth, who is his father's third wife, along with her son Mark, who is Barak's half-brother. And the intellect gene of Barak Sr. seems to carry through to all of his children because we learn that Mark is a physics student. He's brilliant and he is just as ambitious as Barak's siblings Oma and Roy. But there is a very important difference. Mark seems to not want to have any kind of connection to the old man. And Barak pushes him. He knows that he's pushing Mark, but he really truly wants to understand this detachment. On page 185, Barak asks Mark, "Don't you ever feel like you might be missing something?" At the dinner table, Mark puts down his fork and knife and he looks Barak in the eye and responds, "At a certain point, I made a decision not to think about who my real father was. He was dead to me even when he was still alive. I knew that he was a drunk and showed no concern for his wife or his children. That was enough." It's interesting how so different the memory of a shared relative can be. Because when we hear from Oma in earlier chapters, and even through Roy's pain, they seem to recollect a love with their father, a connection of some kind. But with Mark, it's completely missing. Barak is wise to make a distinction here, not to quickly jump to a conclusion as he takes in Mark's answer. And Barak says, "It made you mad." It's not really a question, it's more a statement of understanding. And I think that when Mark responds by saying, "Not mad, just numb," I can feel a softness for Mark's experience. I wonder if in the same ways in earlier chapters, Barak refrained from looking at his father's letters and for a long period of time just stopped even writing letters back and forth, if it's that same self-preservation of the heart. That numbing is actually a necessary form of protection to be able to continue in a way that maybe isn't as fragmented as Roy seems to be. I have a lot of tenderness for Mark. I've gone no contact with my family fully, and it is as a result, unfortunately, of abuse. I promised I won't trauma dump on the podcast, and so I will leave it at that. But I do understand Mark's method of protection. I recollect from episode 5 where we read about not caring being the spirit conserving itself until it can afford to care again. And I wonder if Mark's whole life is built inside of this sacred conservation. And it seems to some degree to have worked for him because here he is able to be brilliant and be so smart in getting his education. And that is a way of maybe accessing a peace, a way out. Who am I to argue with a man at peace? And still, Barak can hold this understanding for Mark's experience, but also feel sad. Here are two sons with the same father. One just decides to stop asking questions because it costs too much. And then the other cannot stop asking. And I don't think Either of these brothers are wrong. They are paying a different tax, a different bill for the same inheritance in the best way that they can. But then I'm reminded in gratitude of the beautiful ways that we are able to create home and belonging, as I've spent so much of my life reading about belonging in books and watching films and listening to music. I'm so grateful that home and belonging can mean so many different things. In chapter 18, Barack gets to board an overnight train from Nairobi toward Lake Victoria into Luo country. And before this trip at dinner, Barack tries to fit in and he calls the place that they're going to Home Square. But Roy corrects Barack on page 198 in saying, "It's not Home Square, it's Home Squared." Amma explains that there is your ordinary house in Nairobi, and then there is your home in the country, where your people come from, your ancestral home. Even the biggest minister with a mansion in the city will point at a small hut on that land and tell you that that is where he is from. I love this part of the book so much, and it reminded me of the intention behind my name, Kaya, because where I'm from, Ikaya, it means the same thing as what Roy is describing here of home squared. I was listening to the Oprah Winfrey and Kiki Palmer interview that just recently aired, but I refer to the beginning of the interview where Kiki brings up Oprah's legal name actually being Orpah, a biblical name. But because of the difficulty of pronunciation and varying reasons, her name evolved to Oprah, and how she only discovered this variance so much later in her life, I think in her 20s. For me, Kaya was an incredibly intentional choice, a way that I could remain tethered to a place of origin. As my accent was changing and I was feeling further and further away from my culture, I never wanted to forget my home squared. It's a grounding for me. I chuckle because I think about an interaction I had a couple of years ago where someone had assumed that because this is my accent, that I was far removed from where I come from. I was asking what they were up to, and they were going to see a Nigerian artist perform in our city. And as they were patronizingly describing this artist to me, I turned to them and I said, "You know, I still speak my mother tongue, and here you are, you don't even speak yours." It reminds me of the assumptions that Barack referred to earlier when he'd first arrived in Chicago, when he was at the barber shop and thinking to himself, yes, they assume I'm Black, but what would they do if they saw my white grandpa walk in? Would my Blackness change to them? And if so, how? This idea of Ikaya is not just mine, that it's something that is so universal. Beyond Africa, the timing of this episode is so special to me and so divine. As we spoke of divine timing earlier, this was divine timing for me because as I was reading the closing of chapter 18, where Barack and his family arrive at this compound with a small round hut, there's chickens pecking and there's a mango tree and 2 bony red cows. His grandmother, Granny, is waiting there for him. She takes him in like a delayed parcel that she has been patiently waiting to arrive. As I read this, I thought back to my most beloved grandmother, my Gogo Mary. She is who raised me. She is where my soul and my belonging is tethered to, the relative that loved me the most in my entire life. Unfortunately, soon after I left my home when I was 10, she passed away suddenly from a heart attack. But when I read this chapter, preparing for today, I realized that this is the same week as my Gogo Mary's homegoing to heaven. Reading about Barack's granny, I wonder if my Gogo was coming to visit me, reminding me that home is something that has taken on so much meaning because of her still powerful presence in my life. That though I am now fully untethered from my kin and my blood, that I still have her. For you, I wonder if home takes this additional meaning. Loved ones that have passed on to another realm. I'm grateful for the ways that Barack and Bruce Springsteen spoke of ghosts and ancestors on their podcast called Renegades. They spoke of what happens when we allow ourselves to process through those that have passed on. In their case, the wounds that they had experienced from their fathers, but how now their fathers can be evolved from being ghosts to ancestors, and how ancestors carry so much peace. I feel so much peace when I think about my Gogo Mary. I think about the big gap between her front teeth when she'd smile really big. For some reason, she'd always wear her wig backwards. And I remember this one time we'd gone to the market to get fruit and veg, and there was a woman who was asking for change and for food on the street. And my Gogo Mary right then and there took her wig off her head and put it on this woman's head and said, "I hope you get a little more because you're going to look so much cuter now with that wig." I miss her, but I'm so grateful to continue to keep her memory alive and to be tethered to something that is so much bigger than one place. For you, I'm curious if home takes a similar non-structural form. What is it like? Does it feel good? Is it filled with ancestors? As I close off on chapter 18, I also think about another way that we find home, and that is with each other. I have found home in beautiful earth angels that from the outside would look like the most odd bunch of characters. But these beautiful souls have taken on these beautiful roles in my life. I'm so grateful that belonging and family can also evolve with these beautiful earth angels. I hope that you can take a moment to give gratitude for your earth angels if you are in a similar situation where you are no longer tethered to your family of origin. And I also pray for you, as I pray for me, that we continue to cultivate family and belonging, our own home squared, in beautiful and unique ways that continue to expand our understanding. And with that expansion, may we grant that to others, blessing as we have been blessed. Thanks to Oma's translation. Chapter 19 belongs to Granny. Under the mango tree, Granny gives Barack the whole story of the family. But this time it's different to that of which he received in chapter 15 from his aunt and Ruth and his half-brother. Granny tells Barack about his grandfather, Onyango, the stubborn, exacting man who had worked for the British but was never broken. She describes Barack's father as a brilliant boy who flew too fast but was unfortunately broken a little differently. She speaks of generations of gifted men who collided with a world that kept moving the ceiling. And by the time Granny finishes, Barack's old man is no longer a myth or a ghost or a fragmentation of these pieces he's been gathering throughout the book. He is a man with a father of his own. Later on, Barack is able to walk out to the two graves in the yard. And there he finds his grandfather's grave that is marked with a plaque. But his father's is just a bare yellow tile with no name. A man whose name had opened the airport now doesn't have a name on his own grave. My heart broke into a few pieces here. I imagined Barak dropping to the ground and sweeping his hand across the tile, speaking to his father in this only tangible place that he has left. Barak writes on page 228, "O Father, there was no shame in your confusion, just as there had been no shame in your fathers before you, no shame in the fear or in the fear of his father before him. There was only shame in the silence that fear had produced. It was the silence that betrayed us." I wept beside Barak when I read this passage. I too was sitting between the two graves with him as he wept and he wept and he wept. But something I'd missed in reading the book in the past was that the weeping was healing and that the weeping came to an end at some point. And how important it was that no matter how many times he cried in Chicago or in New York, that the grief that happened at this place, after Granny had given him the proper context of his history, that he could grieve properly, and the necessity of that, in that letting go and in that release. Barak continues on page 229. When my tears were finally spent, I felt a calmness wash over me. I felt the circle finally close. I realized that who I was, what I cared about, was no longer just a matter of intellect or obligation, no longer a construct of words. I saw that my life in America, the Black life, the white life, the sense of abandonment I'd felt as a boy, the frustration and hope I'd witnessed in Chicago, all of it was connected with this small plot of earth an ocean away, connected by more than the accident of a name or the color of my skin. The pain that I felt was my father's pain. My questions were my brother's questions, and their struggle, my birthright. I am really grateful for this passage and the ways that Barak is able to articulate his grief in a way that isn't doom and gloom, but in a way that is a path to healing and a future. I'm remembering in episode 5 where Barak has that nightmare after his father's passing, and in his dream he is his father's jailer, his judge, and his son. I felt like in this moment his dream came to resolve, but this time he's awake and he's actually on soil. Granny helps free him, and I don't think it is a coincidence that Oma, who had shared of her insight and wisdom earlier, is able to also be a part of this moment as the translator. Under a mango tree. How sweet. I'm so grateful for this podcast and the opportunity that it's provided to slowly savor these stories and experiences. It's been helpful inspiration and helpful vocabulary that I can borrow in my own healing. That in those times where I feel so untethered, like I'm floating in outer space, that I can take this inspiration from Barak's stories and so many stories in books and films and music and everything, and make my own tethers. I am so determined not to continue living this life so alone and lonely. And with that determination, I want to stay open to beautiful connection and creating a new home for myself. I don't want to remain isolated. And I go back to episode 3 where we reviewed the film Mississippi Masala. At the end where Jay flies back to Uganda looking for his Okello, but instead of Okello being alive, unfortunately, Okello has passed. Both men seem to kneel on the soil that has made them an ocean away from the life that they are now building. And they get this medicine in release. As I reflected on this chapter in particular, it coinciding with my grandmother's homegoing, I thought about release in a very different way. I invite you along, and it doesn't have to include people passing away or passing on. There can be so many fractures that happen for varying reasons in our lives. And I hope that for you, you're able to read this chapter in your place that allows you to be in sweet ease, no matter where you are, and to allow that release however it can occur for you. As my body takes on the same thing that took my grandmother, extremely high blood pressure, I am making attempts to slow down, to breathe more. But this chapter reminded me that the carrying of so much, silent carrying, is what causes this heaviness in the center of my chest. In an attempt to release that heaviness, I allowed the tears to flow. I listened to my Coco Mary's favorite songs by Elvis and Dolly Parton. I thought fondly of her. I thought about her affirmation and how much she made me feel like the most special girl on the planet, and how I can still return back to that, carry it forward and evolve it and make it something new. We are reminded that we are the judge and the jailer. We hold that key for our release. As chapter 19 comes to a close, it ends in a way that only divine moments in our lives could end. A light rain begins to fall. It's tapping on the leaves above the graves. And one of Barack's younger brothers, Bernard, comes out with a bent-up old umbrella and asks Barack for a cigarette. These two brothers share a cigarette under a mango tree. How beautiful is that? Now, we're not quite done with the book yet. We still have the epilogue, and I think this epilogue deserves some time. Barack moves quite quickly as he describes going back home, eventually law school, but he writes one line on page 232 that struck me as so poignant for this point in time. But that's not all the law is. The law is also memory. The law also records a long-running conversation, a nation arguing with its conscience. Y'all, when I tell you I was shook, I was shook. A nation arguing with its conscience. When I think about the indigenous people that are so impacted by the wildfires ablaze right now, when I think about laws and history, land and treaty, this means something so different to me today as opposed to when I read it at a different point of maturity. This is the most generous and demanding definition of law that I think I've ever read. It means the argument itself is a machine that is working. For me, I interpreted this as every generation showing up to this argument differently over and over, evolving that long-running conversation, continuing to page 233 in a way that only Barack Obama can. When I think back to Yes, We Can, there's a passage that I think can be permitted as it says that cursed C word. What is our community? And how might community be reconciled with our freedom? How far do our obligations reach? How do we transform mere power into justice, mere sentiment into love? Barack gives his honorable mention to his queen Michelle on page 233. It seems he is expansive in certain parts of his life, but brief and concise in others. But his brevity is not indicative of a lack of reverence. He writes about Michelle in this endearing way. I think I've learned to be more patient these past few years, with others as well as myself. If so, it's one of the several improvements in my character that I attribute to my wife, Michelle. This arrival of his great love isn't detailed, and I wonder if it's to preserve the sacredness of his relationship with her. I'm also curious if the timing of when this book was released, before his 2008 historic run, if he wanted to explore certain parts with the intention of fortifying his groundedness so that he could embrace this future chapter as equipped as possible. I hope I'll be able to ask him that one day. But for this great love of his life, how beautiful that he could acknowledge this blessing that she is. Barak paints us a beautiful portrait of Michelle in the epilogue. A daughter of the South Side, raised in one of those same bungalow-style houses that he had spent hours visiting during his first year organizing in Chicago. His organizing years were walking past her childhood home, and neither of them knew. I love how Barak describes Michelle's practicality, reminding him of Toot, and how her practicality beautifully contrasts the dreamer in him in similar ways like his Gramps and the old man. It's so special that after the engagement, Barak is able to bring Michelle to Kenya with him, and in a way that doesn't surprise me, her Luo vocabulary soon surpasses his. In a way that I think this book does such a beautiful job of weaving joy and grief beside each other. Michelle and Barak get engaged, but Michelle's father passes before he could give his daughter away at the wedding, and Gramps follows a few months later. They go ahead with the wedding, and it's special that Reverend Wright, who we spoke of so much in last week's episode, officiates their wedding at Trinity, the same sanctuary that we left off with that sermon about the audacity of hope. This book is so sweet. I didn't want it to end as I read the final pages of the epilogue again. But that is life. We must carry the sweetness forward on to the next venture. This book has been a reinvigoration of my hope and belief that there is so much more than the world I know right now, that freedom can still be possible. I'm grateful for the much-needed renewal of strength from this book. I know that I can fight for my freedom and that it will come soon. I've been reminded that I too am worthy of the joy and the goodness that this life has to offer. I'm so encouraged to advocate for my freedom, not to accept this grave. And I hope that as we continue our explorations through so many different kinds of sweetness, that we can start to feel that same belief that we noticed with Barak's organizing comrades, as they were discovering their power and trying it on for the first time, that in your own ways, you can discover power that you might have thought was long lost. Thank you so much for savoring this book with me. It's been such an honor, truly. I feel changed, and I hope that you have been impacted in beautiful ways by the sweetness of this book. I would love to hear from you. What resonated? If you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, and to follow wherever you connect with others online. It means a lot to have your support. I hope you'll tune in next week as we review the documentary Saquon about, you guessed it, Saquon Barkley, the iconic football player. This documentary was released in 2025, and it's directed by Alex Pappas and executive produced by Martin Scorsese. This documentary was filmed over 5 years ago as Saquon was recovering from an ACL tear in 2020. Imagine on your birthday, it's Super Bowl Sunday, and your team wins the Super Bowl. We get to follow the journey that leads up to that epic Philadelphia Eagles, go Birds, Super Bowl win. And what struck me about this documentary was Saquon's quiet humility as he overcame so much. Also, that split, how does he do that in the air? Thank you so much again for spending time with me. Thank you for savoring the memoir Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama with the most grateful heart. I'll see you soon, sweetness.